Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the three of you who are here, and for those of you online. Just to introduce myself briefly, my name's Sam McKee. I'm the Associate Tutor in History and Philosophy of Science at Manchester Metropolitan University, where I've just in the tail end of my doctorate in History and Philosophy of Science there. I'm doing a fully funded doctorate at the University of Reading in DNA repair. So I publish a lot in cancer genetics, but also on space science. So I publish a lot on the hazards to DNA posed by solar radiation and galactic cosmic rays. And 2 years ago, at PERC, I was managing a team of students and we won a competition. So I had an experiment flown to the International Space Station by SpaceX, which is very, very exciting. So I may never go into space, but I feel like a tiny piece of me has. Which is very cool. I do have a theology degree and did study theology and science and religion as well. But really my foundations are in genetics. So why am I here talking about a physicist? That's because my history and philosophy of science research is really on Einstein's generation, the interwar physicists, and how they really saw and understood the new world, and in particular how they interpreted the new physics to a popular audience. And so today I've got the job of summarizing one of the most significant but more surprising popular scientific titans of the first half of the 20th century. His books sold in massive numbers. If they were compared to today's numbers, he would outsell most of the modern popular science communicators that you could get in Waterstones or Blackwell's. Sir James Jeans is criminally unknown and underappreciated. His legacy is overshadowed, obviously, in physics by the likes of Einstein, but in terms of the Christian faith and understanding and interpreting it, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, and Chesterton sort of blew it away, really. But along with Sir Arthur Eddington, he represents a group of early astrophysicists and philosophers of science who made vital contributions to these disciplines, yet publicly advocated for theism. His writings all open the door to Christian belief in a time of great humanist upheaval. And so he's so awesome, he ticks all the boxes, he's a fellow of the Royal Society, his accolades are massive, so why haven't you heard of him? That's what we're going to get into here. So to give an image of how significant Jeans was, I want to show this picture from the 1911 Solvay Conference. Obviously, very, very famous conference. This is the first ever Solvay Conference. The Solvay Conference still runs to this day, but those old ones were legendary. They were gatherings of physicists and some separate ones for chemistry to get together the finest minds to solve the biggest problems. And this is the first one. It was invitation only to solve the biggest problems in physics. This one was emerging from the earlier quantum theory. In this picture, you can see Lorentz, Marie Curie, Poincare, Max Planck, Lindemann, de Broglie, Ernest Rutherford, Albert Einstein, and there's Sir James Jeans right there. So he belongs in that crowd right at the very beginning. He was also present at the second Solvay conference in 1913. He deserved to be there, absolutely deserved to be there, as a physicist, as a mathematician, and as an astronomer. As a student at Trinity College, Cambridge, he won the mathematical tripos. He was a second wrangler, and he was a fellow of Trinity College by the age of 24 in 1901. He was professor of applied maths at Princeton for 5 years before returning to Cambridge. Between 1923 and 1944, he was part of Caltech's Mount Wilson Observatory. Eddington and Jeans were the central figures of early British cosmology. So Jeans is one of the most important people in the birth of astrophysics as a discipline in the UK. And around the world. His early monographs were very important textbooks for a long time. You will have heard of the Jeans length, the Jeans instability, the Rayleigh-Jeans law, and the Jeans escape are all concepts in physics. He was a fellow of the Royal Society in 1906 before he'd even turned 30. He won the Royal Medal of the Royal Society in 1919. He won the Gold Medal of the Royal Astronomical Society in 1922. He was knighted in 1928. He gave the Christmas lectures in 1933. He has craters on the moon and Mars named after him. He was given the Order of Merit in 1939. He is a true polymath and a Renaissance man, publishing across 3 disciplines at a time of immense importance for them. So why haven't you heard of him? I want to point several lines of interest for you in terms of religion, because there's so much that could be said about Jeans. But let's just, we're at a science and religion conference. Let's talk about this. Okay, so this was the Wild West in the late teens, immediately after World War I. and going through the 20s, there were a lot of battles about the interior of a star, the birth of stars, the death of stars. There was a lot of furor and tension. You read accounts from the Royal Astronomical Society of arguments going on until 3 o'clock in the morning, but people packing out venues just to watch Jeans and Eddington in particular argue furiously. You know, these British gentlemen smoking their pipes are then just doing a lot of personal battles till late into the evening. But these were very fruitful clashes. There was a lot of heat, but there was also a lot of light. And what emerged from this was a lot of philosophical reflection, which spilled over into faith. Pivotal figures here, you'll recognize one of them at least. The baton was passed from these guys to the very famous next generation, and central to that next generation was Subrahman Chandrasekhar. You'll have heard of Chandrasekhar, the Nobel Prize winner. But he's flanked here by Sir Arthur Eddington, who was a Quaker, and Edward Arthur Milne, who was a Christian. In 1952, he wrote the book Modern Cosmology and the Christian Idea of God, which is an old, forgotten treasure. And over here you have Sir James Jeans. And unfortunately, Chandrasekhar kind of got caught in the crossfire a little bit. I think for this brilliant young Indian mind, it was a bit much seeing these older English gentlemen just get personal attacks on each other as their method of doing astronomy. But Jeans emerges out of this group to write some of the best-selling popular science works explaining what the new discipline of astrophysics was to the general public. And much like Eddington, he would leave a chapter in that was a reflection on philosophy and theology, which you wouldn't expect during this, humanist boom period of interwar optimism. I spoke to his son, Christopher Jeans, who's still alive. And Jeans says that he wasn't baptized as a child. Sir James Jeans grew up in a very Victorian religion home, but it turns out, according to Milne, that he would spend most of his time in church as a young boy thinking about perpetual motion rather than listening to the sermon. He was not much more than a nominal church attendee, going occasionally and especially at Easter and Christmas. So how was it that by the time of 1930, when his best-selling book, The Mysterious Universe, is released, country vicars all over Britain are quoting it in their sermons, and he becomes a poster child for why modern science shows you can believe in God? Yeah, how does that happen? Well, part of it is Jeans lands on what I call mathematical deism, which he speculates a lot about religion, and in each of his works he's very open and forthright in this speculation, but he conceives of God as a master mathematician, a pure mathematician. This is the boom period of physics, and it raised huge questions. There was a need for interpretation and translation for a popular audience. God was no longer an engineer anymore. That was Newton's legacy. The new legacy is that God is a mathematical mind. Much like Eddington, Jeans lands in idealism, that the dualism of Descartes is not true, and mind is now more fundamental than matter. The individual observer is very, very important, has become more important. Now, is it surprising that someone who was a mathematician first kind of decides that God is a mathematician? Well, probably not. But he thought that pure mind and pure maths had come to the fore. Now, he raised the ire of Bertrand Russell. I mean, Russell's not the sweetest guy in the world, and so you could get on the wrong side of him quite easily. Russell wrote 2 books which were essentially hit pieces on Eddington and Jeans. One called The Scientific Outlook, and then later a short one called Science and Religion. If you read either of them, it's pretty clear that Russell probably didn't actually read Jeans's books, let alone Eddington's. But he has this quote in it, that Sir Arthur Eddington deduces religion from the fact that atoms do not obey the laws of mathematics. Sir James Jeans deduces it from the fact that they do. Neither of those are true. But the thing was, churches all over the country were full of people now saying the new science points to belief in God being a lot more viable. Some of the debris between science and religion has been cleared, says Sir James Jeans. Apparently Russell was furious that Jeans got knighted, sort of took it personally, thought it was offensive and a mistake. But both Eddington and Russell say no, God's not a master mathematician. But for Jeans, the new science pointed the way that he must be. And I've got to highlight his best-selling book, The Mysterious Universe, which really sold in huge, huge numbers. Jeans's first books are all essentially academic textbooks, which were very heavily used and used for a long, long time, went into multiple editions. But once he gets to The Universe Around Us, and then the following year, The Mysterious Universe, you're talking about books selling in about 100,000 copies in 1929, 1930. Around the time that he was knighted, he's a household name. And what he wanted to do was open up what the theistic and philosophical implications were of the new science. And he landed on two things: idealism, that mind was more fundamental than matter, and as a result of that, that there was a God and that God was a master mathematician, that the universe, the very fabric and structure of the universe, is constructed in pure maths, emerging from a mind, a mathematical mind. He says this quote in it: "The stream of knowledge is heading towards a non-mechanical reality. The universe begins to look more like a great thought than like a machine. Mind no longer appears to be an accidental intruder into the realm of matter. We ought rather hail it as the creator and governor of the realm of matter." And this was a stunning thing for the general public to hear from one of the most celebrated scientists of his time. Remember, in 1931, the BBC holds its first ever symposium on science and religion. And Jeans was not a key speaker at it, but Eddington was. So at this time, people are looking to the Cambridge men of physics to explain things. And this is a boom period for science and religion, which has been forgotten and overlooked by science and religion academic study. Right, let's move to Jeans's next works, because I know I'm running out of time. I've highlighted also the new background of science. We talk a lot about ideas like fine-tuning. I think Jeans and Eddington, but particularly Eddington, stumbled upon fine-tuning before it really became popular a couple of decades later. But they started to explore and really probe the underlying fabric and structure of the universe and came to idealistic conclusions and theistic conclusions. Jeans raises a lot of questions without answering them. It can be quite frustrating to read, but he is inspiring wonder and pointing people tentatively towards God, leaving many people to wonder about what his exact faith is. Even today, people debate what Jeans's final religious position was. But given that Jeans was so close to the early quantum physics, the birth of cosmology, and mathematical physics, it led him to see God as a mathematical mind behind the fabric of it all. And so the final thing I want to leave you with is this idea of maths in the universe and what it points to. A popular argument for God is called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, and it's popularized by Eugene Wigner, who came slightly after Jeans. But Jeans beats Wigner to that and doesn't get credit for it. Jeans precedes Wigner, but he lands differently to what other people do today. See, Jeans's position, I think part of the reason why he's not celebrated in science and religion, is partly because he's not any kind of conservative evangelical or a Catholic or someone who would be more known. He's a little more vague, but is probably because he's less evidential. He's more philosophical, and he's certainly not evangelical. His ultimate answer is idealism, that it's mind, but mind with a capital M, not a small m. The universe is mind, capital M, and maths first. That's what the universe is. And because these are immaterial, God is plausible, therefore even likely. But as he says, the universe is a great thought, not a great machine. He lands more like George Berkeley rather than René Descartes. But there's a difference here in degree of what Jeans offers us today than what you might find in other science and religion dialogue, and especially in apologetics, I suppose. You know, the intelligent design advocates would say, oh, it is so perfect, the underlying maths and equations behind the universe, there must be a designer with a capital D. More subtle Christian apologetics would say, oh, there's beauty and elegance in the mathematics and it points to a God. Fair enough if people want to make those claims. But Jeans is more like here. The underlying fabric of the universe shows the fingerprint of a mathematical mind with a capital M. And he would draw on relativity and quantum physics and the early days of cosmology for that. But more so, Jeans probably leaves us, rather than pointing to a God, rather than an evidential position, this is a problem for the atheist. This is a question the atheist has to answer that the Christian has a plausible and ready answer to, which is the underlying fabric and structure of the universe cries out for an explanation of which there currently is none. It can be universally applied and written in maths, and it seems to point to mind. This is something for the atheist to answer, which the Christian has a ready answer for, rather than an evidential proof in itself. Okay. Thank you very much. There's so much more we could say about genes, but I'll leave it there and take your questions. Thank you, 3 friends who came.
I'm just thinking of James Jeans. I've certainly got, he goes down the idealism line as this is the primary reality, and you're much better trying. So how effective do you think that can be in the 2020s compared with when he formulated those ideas? Do you think that still has power to speak to and communicate widely in this part of the 21st century?
So I'm more optimistic on that now. I think there's a historical nuance to the question, which is that Einstein's generation, of which Jeans and Eddington are part of, many of them tried to come up with a theory of everything, and they all wrote more philosophically. So Jeans writes Physics and Philosophy in 1943, Eddington writes The Philosophy of Physical Science in 1939, Werner Heisenberg writes his own book called Physics and Philosophy. Einstein, Eddington, a number of those guys all attempted to come up with a theory of everything and failed. There was great excitement and expectation that you could now solve, you could unite relativity and quantum physics into one big equation. And because they failed, it's kind of a cautionary tale to the next generation. You then get Feynman's generation and those who, rather than being optimistic about answering ultimate questions or getting philosophical at all, they just drill down into the practical applications and they start trying to locate all the subatomic particles and probe deeper. And you have a generation that has no interest in philosophy or the ultimate questions. Feynman famously hated philosophy of science. Now, Richard Feynman is my favorite physicist of all time, ever. But he despised philosophy of science because by the time Jeans's generation is gone, it's become its own discipline and people are getting really into it. And you have this massive influx of non-scientists taking up philosophy of science and doing well. In particular, you've got Thomas Kuhn, not a scientist, who it's been included in the top 10 most important books of the 20th century, but made a lot of scientists irate, and I can understand why. Karl Popper as well becomes a famous philosopher of science, but not from a science background himself, more from politics. So you have a large period of a couple of decades where physicists aren't interested in philosophy so much, and they don't want to engage with it. So the questions that were brought about idealism and what's the nature of ultimate reality, they kind of sit fallow for about 30 or 40 years. And later on with Stephen Hawking's generation, Martin Rees, those guys, you start getting a trickle back into philosophy and questioning it. But it mostly becomes sort of an academic discussion of interest for older physicists later on. Well, the reason why I'm optimistic is, have you heard of panpsychism? Yeah, now all of a sudden you have people getting this back in vogue. I heard there's a discussion on Premier Unbelievable about panpsychism, and the panpsychist on that credited Arthur Eddington with being like the modern father of it. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. They're looking at that generation and saying, you know what, actually, the questions raised by physics suggest actually that consciousness might be fundamental to reality rather than matter. And now you've got philosophers and physicists saying, you know what, maybe mind is more that. Roger Penrose, The Emperor's New Mind. He first gave his discussion on The Emperor's New Mind at an Arthur Eddington Memorial Lecture in the 1990s. So now, a century later, you suddenly seem to have this returning to consciousness being fundamental, and not an ethereal Deepak Chopra style kind of is consciousness a quantum thing, more like actual physicists and technical philosophers like Philip Goff saying, we can look at physics and come to a reasonable conclusion that mind is fundamental. And it's suddenly just come back out of nowhere after a couple of generations of being fallow. That was a very long answer to your question, but I think it is reasonable today.
I don't know if what you're saying is that he was like actually a Christian, not necessarily, but open to religion, not a complete waste of time.
Yes.
And I'm kind of drawing parallels today, and like if that is a part of the reason as to why Jesus' work became so popular, because right now I'm thinking of like Jordan Peterson, a psychologist all of a sudden now.
Yeah.
Christian apologists are utilizing his work, and he's kind of in a sense taken the place of many Christian apologists.
Yes.
Because he's not Christian, and that's the thing that's made his work so effective. Just being a Christian, and then so
I think that's a really good, interesting analogy. Actually, I would put him in that category. Now, like Jeans is nominally Christian in a Victorian British sense, and I don't think it's much more than that. But I've spoken to, I have a friend who did his doctorate in theology on Jeans, and he says Jeans is a Christian in this sense. And I've met people in the physics front who are like, no, Jeans wasn't a Christian. He was like this. And you meet three people who've studied Jeans. You've probably met all the people who've studied Jeans, and they all land on different places. But I would say he's Christian with a small c, if you could put it that way. But he certainly didn't raise his children to be baptized or confirmed or anything, but they went to church occasionally because it was a good thing to do and a part of being British. But he's certainly no atheist, and he is he's very, very much of the conviction that a God exists and that God is fundamental. And if you listen to his descriptions of God, he seems to be talking about the Christian monotheistic conception of God. He's not pantheistic in any sense. Yes, his success really came from Russell mercilessly berated British clergy and Catholics and all that for suddenly becoming Quakers in the style of Eddington and nominally Christian in the style of Jeans. You're like, you're quoting all these people in favor of science pointing to God, and they don't even go to your churches, that sort of thing, which just Russell found just incensed him. And you can tell a lot about a person by their enemies. So I think he was nominally Christian, and his power came from the reasons you've just mentioned, which we see in people like Peterson today. There was great power in that. We're very much locked on to C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and those who were very successful later. I think at a loss of these people whose books sold into such Jeans and Eddington are just two. Like, there is a great wealth of theistic physicists who were at the prime during the biggest boom period in the history of science, that interwar physics boom, who are undiscovered, unknown, and underappreciated, which is a shame.
Okay, you won't be able to answer this. Just where the Jeans, from what you say, seem to focus on the mind, the mathematical explanations of the universe. In a lot of understandings of theism, there are also things about the famous Kant quote about awe and wonder, the starry heavens above, and the moral law within the ethical framework, our sense of awe and wonder. And there are other things, again, which would get you more into more conventionally Christian theism, the primacy of life in human life, primacy of beauty, all of those things. So is there anything in Jeans that went beyond the mathematical idealism and pointed in those other directions?
So these guys are, much like myself, all in on wonder and awe and question raising, not in on evidence. They're not evidentialists. Eddington's very, very explicit that the idea of proving God from science is laughable, and I'm in agreement with them. And Jeans is very much this. The mysterious universe, I think, is the best example of it. He's raising it all. He's wondering. He's pointing at things like this. And for him, that's where the conviction comes from. When it comes to the data, he's making this point, I think, here at the bottom, which is it's a question to be raised, and God is plausible as a result of it. And I'll say no more on what that is like, or that it proves the convictions of the Bible or anything like that. Yeah. Sorry, thank you.
That was Absolutely fantastic.
No problem.
And
Thanks,
someone
friend.
you were
Glad you
absolutely
enjoyed
right, I'd never heard of, despite teaching philosophy for a very long time. Someone I will definitely be going and reading about. So thank you
Cool.
very, very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.